We will get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for starting your week with us and for joining today's webinar on prescription drug affordability boards. My name is Olivia Backus, and I serve as counsel to AIMED Alliance, the organization hosting today's webinar. Next slide is here. For those of you who may be new to our organization, AIMED Alliance is a not-for-profit health policy organization that seeks to protect and enhance the rights of healthcare consumers and providers. AIMED Alliance works to ensure that people can access safe and effective healthcare treatments that are most appropriate for their individual needs. Next slide. We're excited for today's discussion on prescription drug affordability boards, also known as PDABs. To set the stage for today's conversation, we'll first provide a brief overview of prescription drug affordability boards. Next, we'll transition into the heart of today's discussion, where our panelists will share some valuable insights from current implementation efforts, including both lessons learned and looking forward. Finally, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we invite you to utilize Zoom's Q&A feature. And just as housekeeping, the slides will be shared after, and the webinar is being recorded. Next slide. To help us better understand the complexities and uncertainties surrounding the implementation of prescription drug affordability boards, we've gathered 3 experts to participate in today's panel. I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their involvement with prescription drug affordability boards. Passing the floor to Tiffany.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Tiffany Westridge Robertson. I'm the CEO and original founder of International Foundation Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis. We just say AI arthritis for short. I'm also a person living with axial spondyloarthritis, as are all leaders at our organization are living with the diseases. Arthritis is also leading a national coalition called Ensuring Access Through Collaborative Health for patient organizations and affiliated groups, as well as a corresponding novel patient inclusion council for patients and caregivers, both working independently and together to address government drug affordability reviews, ensuring patient voices are heard and involved throughout the process.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for hosting us and inviting me to be on the panel. My name is Mike Egan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Rare Access Action Project. And at RAP, we are a coalition of patients as well as other stakeholders. And we focus on access to rare therapies, whether it's in government programs or commercial plans, et cetera. And we look at finding solutions that we can broaden access to therapies, coverage, and access to care.
And I'm Derek Flowers with the Value of Care Coalition. We are a group of organizations representing patients, providers, and caregivers whose sort of main thesis on this is that value should be defined by those who know. And so again, we're patients and providers raising concerns about prescription drug affordability boards.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about today's discussion. And without further ado, let's get started with an overview of prescription drug affordability boards. The concept of prescription drug affordability boards emerged in response to the growing concerns over the affordability of prescription medications. The Inflation Reduction Act established a drug price negotiation program allowing CMS to negotiate directly with drug companies in an effort to reduce the price of certain medications. Many states are leveraging this momentum from the IRA's drug price negotiations to control drug price spending within their jurisdictions by introducing legislation that aims to make prescription drugs more affordable, including prescription drug affordability boards. The mechanisms these boards use to influence the price of drugs may not impact the prices consumers pay, raising questions of affordable for who, and a question we'll dive into shortly. Next slide. Before looking at each state's board, let's quickly review some key drug pricing terms and acronyms that will be used today. Starting with most important, prescription drug affordability boards, or PDABs, are state-created boards to assess and address the cost of affordability of prescription drugs within a state. Most typically, these boards have the authority to review the affordability of prescription drugs and set payment limits or spending targets in effort to make them more affordable. Those payment limits are called upper payment limits, or UPLs, which are a price cap on the amount that a payer can reimburse for the purchase of a prescription drug within the state that the board determines is unaffordable. This type of cap does not apply to what a consumer pays, but rather its limit for payers, like private or public health plans, what they can pay. Next to maximum fair price. As just mentioned, the IRA's negotiation program allows CMS to negotiate directly with drug companies to reduce the price of certain medications. The price negotiated for these drugs is known as the maximum fair price. Some states allow or require that their PDABs use the maximum fair price to establish a UPL for prescription drugs. This enables states to apply a federally negotiated prices to state regulated markets. And lastly, reference pricing is a strategy that involves using international drug prices as a benchmark to ensure that the maximum fair price paid for a drug in the US is similar to the cost in other countries. Some states encourage or mandate their PDABs to consider reference pricing when establishing a UPL. Next slide. While the intention behind PDAB legislation is positive, evidence of cost savings has not been established and the methods remain experimental with a no one-size-fits-all approach. Among the states that have enacted PDAB legislation are Colorado, Maine, Maryland, New Hampshire, Oregon, Washington, and Minnesota. The functions of these boards varies across states, with 5 of them having been granted the authority to adopt upper payment limits for certain drugs that the board determines produces or have produced an affordability challenge. Again, UPLs are not a payment limit for patients, but for health plans. The process for setting UPLs typically involves 4 major steps. First, identifying eligible drugs. Second, selecting drugs for affordability review. Then reviewing the drugs to determine whether they are affordable or not. And lastly, if a drug is deemed unaffordable, determining an upper payment limit. Most, but not all of these states outline different factors for consideration during these steps, but none have actually defined what affordable means. And other states leave it to the board to determine the process, allowing the board to proceed upon approval from the state. Colorado has made the most progress. Their board is currently reviewing 5 drugs and has completed 3 reviews so far. 2 were found to be affordable and 1 drug was found unaffordable, and the board is now moving forward with implementing a UPL. When establishing UPLs, the board may consider reference pricing, and the rulemaking process for UPLs is expected to take about 6 months, with initial rulemaking scheduled for June. Moving on to Oregon, in December, the board approved a list of 15 drugs, including 3 insulin products, for review this year. They are reviewing 3 drugs per meeting, which occur on a monthly basis. Next is Maryland. The state has identified a preliminary list of potential drugs for review and is developing procedures for cost reviews, which are expected to begin this year. When selecting drugs for review, the board may consider reference pricing and whether the prescription is currently subject to or has been subject to Medicare drug price negotiations. In Washington, the board is finalizing the drug selection process and expected to announce their list in the coming months. There are no updates yet in Minnesota, as it's the most recent to enact the PDAB legislation. But in setting UPLs, the board is required to consider reference pricing and to use the maximum fair price when setting a UPL for a drug that has been subject to maximum fair price negotiations. Other PDABs that don't have the authority to set UPLs but can set spending targets include Maine and New Hampshire. Maine's board has been operational for several years, but is still working on setting spending targets. And New Hampshire's board established its operational framework last year, aiming to establish an advisory council and recommend legislation this year. In terms of consumer engagement, all the boards provide an opportunity for consumer engagement in some capacity. Some mandate that a consumer representative or patient serves on the board or an advisory council to the board. They all require some sort of opportunity for public comment or input at some point during the review process. And shortly, we'll examine whether these opportunities are effective at ensuring the inclusion of the patient voice. In addition to these prescription drug affordability boards, New Jersey and Ohio have established prescription drug affordability councils, which review drug prices and conduct reports related to drug affordability. And Massachusetts and New York have created drug utilization review boards, which have the authority to negotiate drugs for Medicaid plans. And with that overview, I'll hand it over to Derek to discuss 2024 legislative landscape.
Great, thank you, Olivia. So this year has been very busy on the legislative front. As Olivia just laid out, there are only a handful of states that have authorized PDABs, and to the extent they're beginning their work at all, it's largely preliminary at this point. Yet several states are rushing to consider policies that would sort of spread this work all across the country. And so we've seen legislation to either create or expand authorities for PDABs in something like 10 states this year. Ranging from East Coast states like Connecticut into the Midwest and Illinois and Iowa, and then back to the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, and others. And so, what we're seeing is that these bills have a lot in common. They typically do, as I mentioned, two things: either create a PDAB or a PDAB by another name, or add scope or authority to the PDAB that's already in existence in some of the states that Olivia mentioned. And so they create, a board that seeks to lower the cost of prescription medication. But while they're typically focused on top line costs, their focus, unfortunately, is not also on patient care. And so that's where some concerns come into play. And so what we see is that these boards typically consist of politically appointed economists or others. They can allow for clinician perspective on the board, but not require it. And they don't always allow for patient perspective on the decision-making body either. They typically tend to take a narrow look at value, again, focusing on top-line costs rather than patient care. And for those of us that are on this call and as part of the coalition, we tend to make the point that value isn't always the same thing as price. Each patient values what they get from their medication in a different way, and healthcare providers tend to know that from their patients as well. And then they've often targeted, in states that do exist, medications that treat debilitating medical conditions, which can raise concern as well. But at the end of the day, the legislation that we're seeing around the country typically focuses on one tactic to lower costs. And as Olivia mentioned, that's the upper payment limit. And so, of course, one of the concerns that come from that is the UPL's impact on access for patients. And I think we'll dive a little bit more into that as we go forward.
Thank you, Derek, for providing that overview of the current landscape. Given that the main focus of a lot of this legislation is affordability, let's talk a little bit more about how these boards are going to impact costs for consumers in the healthcare system more broadly. Turning to you, Mike, state legislators are proposing PDAB bills in an effort to make drugs more affordable for consumers. What is the expected impact of PDABs on patients' out-of-pocket costs and access to healthcare, particularly for the rare disease community?
So thank you for the question. That is really the challenge and been our focus of trying to understand the impact of PDAB on patients. As many of you know, a lot of the patient out-of-pocket costs are set by their plan. And that plan could be something they purchase on the individual market, something that's provided by their employer. And so those plans bake in the costs of their therapies into their premiums and their copays. And the copays are set again, by the plans based on actuarial work that the plans do. And so the effort to use PDAB to lower the cost or the price of a product doesn't necessarily translate into lowering the cost of a copay or a premium. And so that's one of the biggest challenges with PDABs is that there's no immediate impact on a patient's out-of-pocket costs. Further, as you look at how PDABs are implemented, they often look at products based on their WAC price. And so that immediately means that they're going to look at rare disease medicines and therapies. And sometimes those are for very small volume products that have a limited number of patients in the state. And may also have a very limited impact in terms of the drug spend of the programs or the plans themselves. And so, again, you're looking at a very narrow population, very limited use, and the potential that you could disrupt access to those. And let me just spend a little time on that, because I think that's the important part. Many rare disease patients have access to their therapies through their plan, through their employer's plan, through an individual market plan, through Medicaid, or through Medicare. And so they currently have coverage. And so again, their copays are set by the plan or the payer, and they're able to gain access to those. Now, we heard in some states, the stories about Medicare Part D and the catastrophic coverage and how patients were having challenges meeting that. And of course, that was a challenge. RAP was very, very involved trying to close the catastrophic coverage. But again, that's a nuance of the plan, not necessarily because of the cost of the medicine. It was basically benefit design. And so that's our biggest concern, is that the rare disease patient model is evolving. And so we have what's developing across the country are a center of excellence network of care for many rare diseases, particularly pediatric rare diseases and neuromuscular rare diseases for peds. And so you often have patients leaving a state, getting care in another state, and sometimes getting their therapies, their prescriptions, et cetera, fulfilled in those states. And so you have a network of purchasing, distribution, and then supply to the patient. And PDAB doesn't account for those complex networks for purchasing, distribution, and supply of drug to patients that are traveling interstate and need access to their therapies. Some centers of excellence are beginning to brown bag, which means that the patient brings their therapy with them. And again, that puts a lot of pressure on the patient to now make sure that they have access through their payer because the facility doesn't want to go at risk for paying for their therapy and not getting the amount that they paid for the drug back after the therapy is administered. And so that's a real challenge where you have a state potentially that exerts a UPL on a drug and the patient is out of state getting their care, getting their drug fulfilled, and that provider can't then charge back into that state at the price that they actually paid for the drug. And so there's a lot of implications in terms of how drugs are utilized, how drugs are purchased and distributed, and the access that provides patients at the other end. Because I think a lot of PDAB supporters sometimes forget that the drug distribution system is interstate, not intrastate. And so drugs are going to be sourced from various locations. Pharmacies are going to purchase them. They're going to get charged. They'll have all sorts of things going on with how they get paid. And so you're putting a whole network of pharmaceutical supply at risk. And again, that impacts patient access and ability to actually get the prescription that they need at the right time in their patient journey.
Thanks, Mike. It's so important to acknowledge that while the intentions behind PDAB bills are commendable, the reality is that they might not align with the desired outcomes and impact access to medications, especially for communities affected by rare diseases. Building on that question on who PDABs will save money for, Derek, can you talk a little bit about the cost for states to implement and operate a PDAB and how that financial cost could be balanced out by potential PDAB savings?
Sure, thanks, Olivia. So what we've seen in states that have PDABs so far is that they've been spending millions to implement the process. One source says that as of last fall, Colorado had spent over $2 million. One source says this spring, Maryland has spent $3 million so far. And as we know, neither of them have completed value assessments for their full list of drugs or implemented an upper price limit yet. One piece of legislation in Maryland, for example, pending legislation, states that $1 million should be appropriated each year for the operation of the PDAB. I'm sure similar states are seeing a similar experience. But again, it's important that they haven't saved a cent yet. And what we know is that analysis is complex. And the more drugs that they study, the more analysis has to be done. And the more that they're going to cost to get that done. And then what happens? When do we see savings if savings is achieved through the upper payment limit? And at what cost does it come? Does it come at the cost of access? Does it come at the cost of innovation? And also we have to recognize that the savings may never happen. You know, Mike mentioned who sees savings. In most of these bills, there's no direct mechanism for patients that are taking the assessed drugs to see any of the savings that are achieved. But when we look at the larger landscape, you can imagine that maybe some of these PDABs, you might think of them as sort of the IRA that you referenced earlier at the micro level, the state level, right? Let's keep in mind that even that process is still unfolding. The maximum fair price is a couple of years away from fruition. There's lawsuits involved, and their negotiations still aren't complete. And at the same time, we have to recognize that the federal government has far more resources and expertise than any state in doing this. And so the idea that these things could be done, you know, fairly to patients, efficiently, and achieve the desired outcome and promote better patient care is maybe tough to swallow, but at the end of the day, costs are mounting for PDABs and savings have not been seen yet.
Thank you, Derek. It appears we might have some concerns regarding the actual extent of savings these boards will generate and who will benefit from them. From an advocacy standpoint, it seems we need to ask ourselves how we can ensure that this conversation about affordability focuses on patient experiences and consumer affordability. Turning to you, Tiffany, given your experience with the Colorado Prescription Drug Affordability Board, can you share with us how patients' voices and lived experiences were considered during affordability reviews?
Sure. And, first of all, thank you for all that wonderful information from Mike and Derek. It's really great stuff. So regarding patient engagement in the drug selection process, I just want to preface that because there was no engagement in how the drugs were selected, nor has there been in any state that I know of who is currently working to select their drug list. And I say that because if we look at how this is all starting at the beginning with the idea that was mentioned earlier with PDABs and the promotions of people who are in favor of them, it really paints a false narrative that the process is going to help all people in the state save out-of-pocket costs on their medications. And there's no wonder that knowing that's where this all started, that the process that's unfolding isn't matching the promise. So the reality is that the process to identify, and in the case of Colorado, 5 drugs, 3 of which target people with autoimmune arthritis diseases. So maybe 20,000 of the 9 million. So it's definitely not all people, as in it is alluded to in the fight to establish these PDABs. And it's solely based on what the state feels is most important for them. So right from the beginning, the process identifies affordability issues for one party, the state, and attempting to make a decision about affordability for the other party, the patient. So disconnect right from the get-go. And as we saw in Trikafta and in Genvoya, the state wasted a lot of time and a lot of money putting these drugs through review only to realize that most of the patients could afford them because of the drug manufacturer assistance programs. And as alluded to earlier, true problems are identified in Medicare, in insurance protocols, in the things that they should be exploring. Now, so skipping the step of initial community research and experience gathering prior to selecting the drugs, in my opinion, as somebody who comes from a research background, it's the first step to making this whole process make any sense to ensure that the drugs that they really choose are both financially challenging to the state and to patients. And then regarding the actual affordability review process, while the board members, we understand that there's many of the board members are actually connected to the Colorado health system. However, it is very unclear how much time or money was dedicated by them to recruit the patients. And so it was largely left to patient organizations to take the brunt of the time and our own expenses to help recruit. We were also asked to do so on a national level, because we were told if they can't get enough data from Colorado, they will reference the national, which did not happen, at least in the case of Enbrel when that was reviewed a few weeks back. So in the end, as we saw in the Enbrel review, they did not even use information from the non-Colorado. So all of those efforts were for naught. But the worst part, in my opinion, of the challenges and pitfalls that emerged from Colorado was in the data gathering and the data analysis process. Again, coming from a background of research, patient research partners have been demonstrated valuable for decades, all across the world, and utilizing patients to review survey design and even be part of analysis is vital to ensure there's no biases, there's no leading questions, etc. So AR arthritis, led by patients, myself included, participated in listening sessions in Colorado and immediately recognized that the survey design was flawed. One of the questions in particular was, do you ever stretch a dose? Do you ever skip a dose? And then it said due to cost. And I stopped and said, I can't even answer this question as stated, because of course I've skipped, of course I've stretched, because of prior authorization, because I knew that my medication wasn't going to go through this big issue of saying I'm medically necessary to take it. So I had to do it for that reason. We informed the board of this on October 3rd of 2023, they acknowledged it. They said they would not change the questions in mid-research without negating the data already collected, which, okay, I understand. But what we didn't expect is then they would go back and use the known flawed data and an additional flawed analysis that was primarily the reason for their review of Enbrel and ruling it unaffordable. As patients, we went back and spent a week looking through how this happened, only to realize of the 38 they did use for Colorado, half of those were on Medicare, so those should have been analyzed separately. The other 19, 10 of them said that the drug was unaffordable for them. And they cited groceries, home payments, etc. And of those, 4 of them said it caused medical debt. What the board did not do, or the people in the analysis that were pitching this, did not go back to the initial data that we did as an organization. And we saw that those 10 out of 19 actually paid 0 out of 50. So a month. And so that lends to the question, what is affordable? What is value to patients? So those are the types of things that I think we have to look at and learn from moving forward. In summary, tedious process, expensive for the state, expensive for patient organizations, a wrong ruling, in my opinion, of being unaffordable and essentially void of determining ahead of time the drugs that are truly high cost. And if they are high cost, they need to do an analysis of why they're high cost. So those are my opinions.
Thank you, Tiffany, for all your advocacy efforts in Colorado and for sharing your insights on the complications in this during these processes with us. Can you share a bit more about how patient engagement varies between states and some of the challenges you've experienced engaging different state PDABs?
Oh, sure. Well, I do want to clarify that when we're talking about boards, there's also staff that we talk to. And the Colorado staff has been amazing as far as wanting to get patients involved, wanting to recruit. Their desire is there. However, having desire to do it and doing it correctly are 2 totally different things. In saying that, I have had conversations with Washington, with Maryland staff, not board members. So there's that intermediate, if you will, in between. Both states, which say they are very interested in making sure patients are engaged, which is great, but we do have a barrier of how the patient can get involved, because it is very difficult for patients generally to speak publicly, so listening sessions, etc. And then even with surveys, if they're flawed to begin with, that's going to create even more of a barrier. In saying that, you've got states like Oregon, who up until recently, nothing, crickets. We have tried to reach out even to staff, nothing. It's not just me. Every organization I've talked to, we're getting nothing. We have written countless letters, we meaning many patient organizations, many groups, countless letters asking, please consider patients before you move forward with affordability. Then suddenly there was of 2024, and they're now holding listening sessions starting in April. The problem with these town halls, or what they're calling is, that I predict that they're going to run into the same problem we saw at Colorado, because they're doing the same process. It's a catch-all, come talk. There's no guidance. There's no patients that I know of involved in the question design that they're going to ask. So it's going to be repeating the same engagement challenges. So this is just another example of the inclusion of patients that are put into these bills that don't actually go into any process development on what that means and how the impact will actually be. So.
Thank you, Tiffany. It's encouraging to hear that the Colorado staff have been receptive to your concerns, and thank you for providing such helpful insights into these variations and challenges encountered in engaging patients. In light of these challenges, Derek, what trends are you observing in PDAB bills in 2024? As implemented, PDABs are beginning their engagement process. Are we seeing any lessons learned amended into the proposed legislation that may address some of the concerns that Tiffany's raised?
Yeah, you do see lawmakers being responsive to constituents' concerns. And so when it comes to patient engagement, our view is the legislative process is ripe for that, right? There's great opportunities for organizations and constituents to raise concerns with legislation that's being considered. And we're seeing that happen in all these states across the country. And so what we've seen is that in some instances, and again, I'm not sure that it's necessarily from based on implementation that's occurring, again, because that's so young in the process, but perhaps from concerned citizens in the state, we're seeing bills that are under consideration being amended to chip away at some of the concerns that have been raised by advocates. In one instance, a bill has received an amendment that will make it more difficult for discriminatory metrics used in assessment, like the QALY, to be used in their process. We've also seen lawmakers considering adding more clearly the patient voice to advisory boards that are then able to advise the PDAB. Of course, challenges still remain, right? Those boards, for example, or the advisory councils are simply that. They're not decision-making bodies. They simply offer input to the PDAB, and it's unclear how much weight the PDAB must give them, or if they should consider that input at all. We've seen states that are implementing their work around requirements to not use the QALY and find ways to still consider some of these assessments through either third parties or through analyses that they collect. And at the same time, none of the amendments that we've seen, despite lawmakers' best intentions, can really get at the biggest problem that we find with PDABs, which is the potential barrier to access that the upper payment limit could create. And so, hopefully as we move forward, it's great to see that these interactions with lawmakers are occurring, that they're taking to heart what they're hearing and trying to fix some of the problems. But I think that we've got a long ways to go to make it really work for patients.
Definitely. It's encouraging to hear that advocates have been able to influence the development of these bills moving forward. As we reflect on the evolving landscape of this legislation, it's become increasingly clear that there is a need for actionable recommendations to address these complexities. With this in mind, let's shift our focus to discussing proactive strategies aimed at fostering more meaningful patient engagement and driving positive change within the realm of prescription drug affordability. Next slide, please. From AIM Alliance perspective, for a more effective approach to reducing costs for patients and enhancing affordability and access, AIM Alliance recommends that lawmakers prioritize changes in utilization management. This includes passing legislation that supports various initiatives such as PBM rebate reform, including requirements for rebate pass-through, as well as bans on copay accumulators and limitations on practices like step therapy and prior authorization. These measures collectively can aim to improve healthcare affordability, ensure better access to care, and will have an impact on consumer affordability. If legislators are moving forward with PDAB legislation, we strongly recommend that their legislation includes provisions appointing a consumer patient representative to the board. This representative should possess firsthand experience with chronic disease or have experience in disability rights law. Additionally, it's important to require PDABs to acknowledge their shared responsibility in engaging patient communities. This involvement shouldn't just be a formality, but an ongoing commitment, and it should extend beyond the initial review stage and continue after UPLs are set, and the board should actively monitor how UPLs impact access and affordability to patients to ensure that their decisions have positive real-world impacts on patients in the state. To speak more on this issue, turning to you, Mike, for states that plan to move forward with proposing PDABs, what recommendations do you have to address concerns you've raised about the rare disease community?
I think you've hit some of those. I know, for example, we talked about technical amendments, and Derek had talked about that a moment ago, and the ability to go back and do some of that work. For example, in Colorado, Senate Bill 60, which would exempt rare therapies from the PDAB. And there are some other technical amendments, such as the QALY reform. But there are also things that we could do, like requiring an access assessment, looking at the pharmaceutical supply distribution system and how an upper payment limit could potentially erode 340B. Medicaid rebates, et cetera, which also have fiscal impact on the state. So again, these things are interconnected, and these are things that if you're going to step in and do something that triggers a lot of other kind of a cascade of other things, then you better be sure you understand those things. And so amendments that can do that and require a more holistic approach are really, really important to look at chargebacks to PBMs, to look at the impact on local pharmacies or hospital pharmacy if you're going to set a UPL. Those are some of the things that we believe that could go back and actually improve decision making. The other thing is to look at patient out-of-pocket costs. And as you have on your slide, of course, copay accumulators is a huge impact on patient out-of-pocket costs, where plans essentially double dip from the patient as well as the nonprofit foundation or manufacturer programs that are providing copay assistance, and then holding the patient responsible by not meeting their upper payment or their out-of-pocket limits in a given year. And so when those resources run out, the patient is still responsible to pay for their out-of-pocket costs. So that is actually a major area that rare disease patients focus on all the time. And one final piece I would add, in Virginia, we are supporting a bill, for example, that would require plans to offer a capped copay out-of-pocket cost. In Virginia, a lot of patients pay a percentage copay of the cost of their drug, whether it's 10%, 50%, 40%, whatever. And what this bill would do is require plans to offer alternative products to the marketplace that would have tiered capped copays. And many states have them. Many people buy them in the individual market. Many employers offer them with a $50 copay or a $100 copay. We want to make sure that plans are required to offer those so that patients can make a choice. So that, again, that would immediately impact their out-of-pockets rather than paying, let's say, a 30% copay on a rare disease med if they have a $100 copay. So those are the types of things that we think that will make immediate impact in patients. And we encourage policymakers to really focus on that. I know as we've been lobbying, particularly in Virginia, Maryland, and in other states, there's a real disconnect between the patient journey and what patients actually pay and what a PDAB or an upper payment limit would actually do and accomplish to impact that. And so I think there's a lot of education that we can do in the middle to help policymakers understand that PDABs are not necessarily a panacea, but that we can do some things immediately to actually impact patient out-of-pockets. And if we need to go back and do technical amendments or to revise PDAB bills, that there are a number of solutions that could meet those needs and probably make the PDAB experience much more holistic to look at the healthcare system as a whole.
Thank you for highlighting those great recommendations. It's important to consider how complicated and interconnected the system is and to look at the real world impact these decisions may have, especially on out-of-pocket costs, as you highlighted. Expanding on this discussion, Tiffany, how can we ensure that patients receive the benefits of reduced costs resulting from the efforts and decisions made by PDABs, as well as beyond?
Yeah, this is a difficult one for me to answer because in the question itself, can we ensure that patients receive the benefits of reduced costs? And we really cannot predict that we're going to see anything from that. And again, as I sort of said in the beginning, I think that's important to highlight what the rationale for establishing a PDAB and where we are now so very disconnected. In saying that, it will likely benefit if anyone, the state, the insurance companies, and the PBMs. In saying that, mimicking what Mike said, education. The educating legislators, even if we have to go back and alter bills. I think that that's something that we really need to focus on right now, in addition to interjecting ourselves to make sure that the processes are happening in a way that will zero in on what these out-of-pocket costs or what the affordability challenges are to the constituents of the state, and assess those, and also consider those people who do get their drugs at a reasonable cost because of manufacturer assistance plans. In saying that, patients need to be involved in any data collection, design, and analysis to ensure that those true costs could potentially be realized in some way, even if that's to realize there needs to be reform or continue looking into existing utilization management bills and things that we're already working on, et cetera, as in like PBM reform as one. Specifically to the different processes, I also think that while those are in a review process that the board should clearly demonstrate before ruling, I think there needs to be a step before that, how this is going to benefit patients and who it's going to benefit. Not having the who is alarming to me at this phase of the game. I also think that for those drugs that are ruled unaffordable and a UPL is applied, there just must be clear language in the bills or addendums that show exactly how much the patient is saving and who is really saving, and how much that the state would be saving. I just really am hopeful that something happens with patient savings, but honestly, even if they do work, then the rest of us who don't want to be switched to the lowest cost drug are going to get non-medically switched. And so I feel like it's a lose-lose for patients either way. And lastly, just reports needs to be mandatory to show how these boards spent their money to do this, then factor everything in, including what trickled down, if anything, to patient costs. And then we can determine the true return on investment to the state and to any savings that went from this process.
Thank you for touching on all those important aspects, especially the need to raise the question of who. I think we can all agree how important it is that we ensure patients are not only included in the decision-making processes of PDABs, but also receive the benefits of the reduced costs resulting from these efforts. Turning to you, Mike, if PDABs aren't effective at lowering costs for patients, what type of legislation would have an immediate impact on consumer cost savings?
Well, we have talked about them already. So we've had some good discussion. For example, copay accumulator bans, or developing legislation that provides patients with options for out-of-pocket in costs in insurance. Those are the types of things that I think can be extremely valuable, and they can immediately provide patients with savings. For example, in the IRA, even though they included, CMS price setting, there is a cap in the out-of-pockets that are paid in Medicare Part D, where they close the catastrophic. Those are the exact very types of things that we can look at the state level that will allow patients to make informed choices, select the plan that works best for them. So, for example, a rare disease patient might select something where they pay a higher premium, but they get capped out-of-pocket costs, so they can manage their resources throughout the year's time, versus let's say a lower premium plan that has maybe higher copays in the form of a percentage of the cost of their drug. So giving patients those types of choices, allowing them to participate in the plans or purchase the plans or have access to the plans that fit their patient journey. Those are the types of things that I think that we could look at that immediately provide savings to patients and reduce their out-of-pocket costs. Again, it's often not the cost of the drug, it's the structure of the plan that exposes the patient to these costs. And so by looking and focusing on those things, we can actually bridge the insurance coverage with what the patient pays and help them, reduce their out-of-pockets or be able to live with and manage their out-of-pockets so that they get the best value from the therapy. Remember, Derek talked about value earlier on, and value is often seen in the perspective of a patient. And being able to provide options where the patients can get increased value for what they're paying for is extremely important. I also think it's really important for us to look at, in PDABs, to look at the impact of a UPL on those types of systems, and make sure that we don't limit access that a patient might already have, and make sure that any decision, again, if we're going to amend or offer solutions, make sure decisions don't impact access, and make sure those assessments are done alongside the UPL.
Thank you for reiterating those insights on alternative legislative solutions to more effectively reduce consumer spending. To wrap up our conversation, I'd like to ask Derek, when looking at the broad landscape, what is something you really wish legislators understood about these boards?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Olivia. I think sort of building off what we heard from Mike and Tiffany, there are a couple other sort of high-level thoughts that I see as I look at legislation. Number one, from our perspective, it might be the case that too much authority is being delegated too broadly to these boards in the first place, right? There's in the legislation I read no accountability for board members. They serve 3 or 5 year terms. They're not elected. And at the same time, we believe that healthcare decisions should be between doctors and patients. They're very personal decisions with different impacts for every patient. And so adding a layer of bureaucracy in that relationship just disrespects the relationship and makes the practice of healthcare all that much harder. I also think, that lawmakers should consider that a clear process needs to be required before anything like this is undertaken. Tiffany outlined the work that's been done in Colorado and some of the concerns in the way that implementation has been going on. For us, the make it up as you go approach might not seem so appropriate for life-changing decisions for the people in your state. And so please, we would hope lawmakers would consider that. And finally, in looking at the PDAB legislation and the implementation efforts, from our perspective, what we see is that the risk for patients is way up here, very high risk, right? You might lose access, there's threats to innovation occurring, while at the same time, the potential rewards by this legislation are way down here, as Mike and Tiffany both mentioned. The setting of the upper payment limit does nothing to ensure that the patients who need it are seeing any of those savings. And so the risk reward proposition for patients and their healthcare providers is very uneven. And then finally, let's think about it this way. Policymakers, in our view, should focus on patient care. States are implementing the types of policies that Mike mentioned, that Tiffany referenced, and they don't need a whole new board to do it. And so it's our belief that getting patients the right treatment at the right time, respecting that clinician-patient relationship, is a way that we can look to save money through better health outcomes rather than through limiting access. And those are our key takeaways.
It's all important points. Thank you for touching on the needs for a clear process, and again, just stopping to look at the impact of these decisions on the lives of individuals. And with that, we'll turn to the questions from our audience. And I'll just pose the question, and any of you feel free to jump in, whoever feels they can best answer. The first question is, in the rare disease or ultra rare areas in which there's only one therapy available, do you anticipate PDABs will still target those therapies? To that end, in which state with the PDAB or setting up a PDAB restricting specific areas from examination by the board?
That's a really good question. And I would answer it this way, is unless there's specific direction to the PDAB, as Derek just mentioned just a moment ago, PDABs have very broad authority. And by not limiting what they look at or directing them, they certainly can look at those single source, single therapy drugs and look at them for a UPL. So it's really important that there's legislative direction on how to look at rare diseases. In some states, again, we're pushing technical amendments to revise how they review these types of therapies. Many of you will remember in Colorado, the initial 10-drug list that came out to look at the drugs that they wanted to begin exploring included almost over half of them were rare disease medicines. And so it's really important to have that kind of direction legislatively to make sure that they don't target that single therapy for a small rare disease or ultra rare population. So it's a lot of it's in the construction that occurs in the legislative language.
Olivia, I'd like to just add on that for a second. Like Mike mentioned, there are now policies being considered to exempt drugs who have an indication for rare disease. There are also legislators I know who are concerned with the impact of the UPL on physician-administered treatments, for example. And how do we deal with that? Is that another exemption? So at the end of the day, let's think about this, right? If we know that this process, or if we agree that this process isn't good for the rare disease patient, it's probably not good for the patient who gets their treatment at the clinician's office. How can we be so sure that it's good for anyone else, right? I mean, if you're starting to say it's not for these, it's not for these, it's not for these, what makes us believe that it's going to work for all of these?
Thank you, Mike and Derek. Those are all great points. Moving on to our next question. Is there a reference document or website that reports and tracks the current PDAB situation as it continues to develop?
I'd just offer that our website, valueofcarecoalition.org, has an advocacy page that attempts at least to track activity by state legislatures and existing PDABs. I can't guarantee it's always up to date at the minute, but by and large, it does a pretty good job of giving you an overview of where these things exist. And I know Tiffany and Mike and others have great resources for this as well.
Yeah, I would just add to what Derek said is that, RAP is building out a tracker. But again, it's a tracker that is limited in terms of, we update it once to twice a week. And so depending on when you view it, when it's been updated, it may be a little bit behind, but we're trying to keep up with it as well.
And I would like to add too, in the coalitions that AI Arthritis is leading, so the Ensuring Access Through Collaborative Health, which both groups represented on here are also members, as we are members of theirs as well. One of the goals of the patient organization and allied groups level is called the National Network. And the model is these are all over the place. We can't possibly have one person manage all of it. So one of the goals of this is to identify, okay, the Value of Care Coalition is doing an amazing job tracking these bills on their website. So we build our website out, which should be launching soon. The goal is to direct people to those, right? And then also to what Mike and his group is doing. And then we will hopefully have a repository with different areas that will link out. As far as for patients in particular, knowing what's happening in your state, we do have the second level patient inclusion council that is led by patients. And so I would also recommend signing up, which there will be a link provided to that. If you're a patient, we will connect you to other patient organizations, to groups like Derek's and Mike's, as part of our obligation to make sure all patients are included and informed.
Thank you. Those all sound great, and definitely highlight how fast-paced this area is, that it's pretty hard to keep everything completely up to date, even on a weekly or bi-weekly update. Turning to our next question. I am in Illinois, and they are looking at creating a PDAB, and we are working with the representative and recommended some changes in which she did amend the legislation to accommodate that. Is there anything in print that I could use to help educate the representative more on the role of the PDAB, the costs incurred, and the setup and patient involvement?
Derek or Mike start, and then I'll weigh in.
Sure. I suspect each organization here has various fact sheets or one-pagers. Certainly we do. As bills get amended, every concern isn't always relevant after lawmakers seek to fix some of those concerns. So use it as a guide, not as a gospel. But I think, for someone concerned about patient involvement, the key is just, making sure that the patient's voice is heard, represented, and respected in this process, starting with legislation and ending with implementation if that's where it goes. But that's definitely a key stakeholder that needs to be part of the discussion.
I would concur with what Derek said. We have some documents on our website that we use to educate legislators on PDAB and the impact on PDAB on rare disease patients specifically. And so we bring up, the Center of Excellence Care. We talk about, the complexity of the drug distribution system, particularly in rare disease, where you may have a product that actually is available only through a single limited pharmacy, and that pharmacy is out of state. And so there's a lot of complexities that we do bring up in some of our materials. And please, if you don't find what you need from a rare disease perspective, let us know, because we can always help you pull that together, or we can pull that together with you. But also in terms of kind of the setup and patient involvement, one thing that I would very much encourage is, if you are from a state that has a rare disease advisory council, there is really a built-in linkage now to the rare disease community. And for rare disease patients, for example, Colorado has a rare disease advisory council, and that rare disease advisory council was not front and center in the selection of the initial list of rare disease medicines for review, and was not front and center during the review of Trikafta. And so if you have a rare disease advisory council in a state with a PDAB, that linkage is critical. And you can find, again, resources with those patient organizations and members of that RDAC to get you additional information that may be helpful during the legislative process in your state.
And then I just wanted to add to that, not fully knowing the stakeholder group here, that Amy, thank you for the question. I do want to make sure that people know for resources too that are patient facing or patient education, patients going in and educating. A primary goal in the next several weeks for the PIC, the Patient Inclusion Council, is to design those one sheets based on the patient voice and in a way that's easily digestible and understandable. So it will be paired with peer-led education to help understand. And we're also open as your peers to listen to any questions, help you to create any messaging that goes along with it. That's just a service as part of the PIC. And I also just wanted to acknowledge, I appreciate, Amy, that you are very specific in asking of the ways that the cost incurred during setup and patient involvement, because those are the exact ways that the PIC works. We listen to what the concerns are and we develop the materials based on what the needs are, both for Illinois and other states. So I appreciate that, because that will influence how our materials turn.
And if we have time for one last question, what specific recommendations do you have for patients looking to get involved in PDABs?
Mine would be start early. Legislation is happening now, so you have the opportunity to shape the way that these discussions are being had right from the get-go. And then, as implementation unfolds, it's clear that these things can take years to happen. And so don't get discouraged. Keep finding ways to make your voice heard.
I would echo what Derek just said. It is so important to get involved early, so that you can shape a lot of the thinking around this. Remember, the proponents of PDAB have a vision and view of how PDABs work, and at times much disconnected from reality. And that's all the legislator has to hear until the legislative process is moving forward, and they're already now vested in the process. And so if you come too late into the process, you may get excluded just because they don't want to change course. And that's a reality. That's something that we hear from legislators all the time. And so being involved early, as Derek said, is so critical. Spending time with your health committees, with their staff, helping them understand your patient journey, your particular disease, and why PDAB is such a concern to you is so valuable to them to be able to balance the other messages around PDAB. The other thing I would add is at RAP for rare disease patients, we have a patient caucus at RAP where our patients are learning more about PDAB and other issues around coverage and lowering patient out-of-pockets, and then connecting them legislatively. Some of our RAP patient caucus members have been involved in Colorado and in other states. And so I would encourage you to get involved with your local, either therapeutically oriented patient organization or with some of the organizations that represent rare disease or arthritis or, patient access, excuse me, like Derek's group, excuse me, and just get involved so that you can get access to that information and be able to advocate early.
Just really quickly, I know we're out of time, but I have to also say, in addition to early, throughout. So there are opportunities, just like the Patient Inclusion Council did for Colorado. We helped patients by connecting them to the research questions. You can help analyze the research questions. You can be part of telling them what the problems are and fixing the processes. You can be at the table with these groups through groups like the PIC. So I do want to also let you know that even if you have little to no experience, we will help you make sure you're involved in every single step of the process before and after a PDAB is established.
Thank you. Those are all such helpful tips to end on. And just as we wrap up, I just quickly want to draw everyone's attention to some resources we've mentioned during the call. The links to these resources have also been included in the chat. In addition to those mentioned, Aimed Alliance also developed comprehensive resources on enacted PDAB bills and proposed PDAB bills in 2023 that go into detail on each state bill, how the board is structured, and the functions and authorities granted to each board. And with that, I'd like to express our gratitude to our panelists for their invaluable insights into the complexities of prescription drug affordability boards. We appreciate you all being here today and really appreciate all the information you provided us. And to those listening, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.